The summer of 1893 was the greatest summer America had ever seen. 27 million people poured into Chicago from every corner of the country and the world. They came by train, by horse, by foot. They saved for months to afford the fare. They wore their best clothes on their backs and packed their children into rail cars and brought their elderly parents who had never been more than 50 miles from where they were born. They came because something had been built on the south side of the city that no one could quite believe, a place that everyone had been calling the White City. 200 buildings, canals lit by electric light, the first Ferris wheel on Earth, rising 260 feet into the Illinois sky, carrying more than 1,000 passengers at a time. Electricity on a scale most Americans had never seen in their lives. The whole exposition ran on it. The buildings blazed with it at night, and people who had grown up by candlelight stood at the edge of the lagoons in the evening and couldn't find words for what they were looking at. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show ran every afternoon just outside the main gates. There was a 1,500-pound statue of Venus de Milo built entirely from chocolate. There was a moving walkway. Nikola Tesla demonstrated alternating current. The first American gas-powered automobile was on public display. It was the future, right there in front of you, and you could touch it. People came to Chicago that summer with their savings in their coat pockets, their best clothes on their backs, and their whole lives stretching out ahead of them. Young women especially, secretaries, teachers, shop girls, farm girls, who had spent years reading about the fair in their hometown newspapers, and finally scraped together enough money and enough nerve to make the trip, came by the thousands. Many came alone. Many had never been to a city this size. Many had no family within 500 miles of Illinois. They stepped off the trains into something loud and fast and overwhelming and thrilling all at once. And they looked around for somewhere to stay, someone to trust, some foothold in all of this newness. 3 miles from the fairgrounds, a man was watching them arrive. He had a building ready. A hotel, he called it. 3 stories, 100 rooms, shops on the ground floor, guest rooms above. The rates were reasonable, the location convenient, and the owner, a charming, broad-shouldered doctor with clear blue eyes and perfect manners, was always there to welcome new guests personally. His name was Dr. H. Holmes. His real name was Herman Webster Mudgett, and the building he had spent 6 years constructing was not a hotel. It was a machine he had designed himself from the foundation up with one specific purpose, and not a single person who walked through its front door that summer knew what that purpose was until it was too late. By the time the fair closed in October, people had vanished. Not 1 or 2, many. Young women who had written home from Chicago and then stopped writing. Employees who had collected 1 paycheck and were never seen again. Men who had handed over their life savings to this charming doctor and then disappeared without a word. The papers would eventually call it the murder castle. Holmes called it home. Herman Webster Mudgett was born in the spring of 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, a small, cold, isolated town set 20 miles north of Concord, where the winters come early and stay until they're ready to leave, and where the silences between neighbors have always passed for a form of respect. Gilmanton, in 1861, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and had known them for generations. A community of farmers and craftsmen and small business owners who attended the same church, used the same roads, and maintained their proximity through a complicated and mostly unspoken system of mutual obligation and mutual surveillance. It was a place where what you did was known and where what you were was assumed from what your family was. The Mudgett family was comfortable by local standards. His father, Levi, was a devout Methodist. Not the warm, community-oriented kind of Methodist, but the severe kind. The kind for whom religion provided primarily a framework of rules and a set of justifications for enforcing them. He believed in total obedience from his children, and expressed this belief primarily through punishment. Not the explosive, unpredictable kind that leaves bruises in visible places, the quiet, systematic kind that a household can organize itself entirely around. The kind that teaches a child, very early and very thoroughly, that the world has rigid rules, and that deviating from those rules has consequences that will arrive calmly, without mercy, and without the slightest acknowledgement that the child might have had reasons. His mother, Theodate, had been a schoolteacher before her marriage, a fact that shaped everything about how she ran the household. People who knew her described her as cold and remote, deeply religious in the way that uses God as a source of rules rather than comfort, and constitutionally incapable of warmth. She managed the children the same way she had managed her classroom, with precision, with high and inflexible expectations, and with very little of anything that might be described as love. Herman was the brightest child in every room he entered, and he knew this about himself from the time he could read. He was the kind of bright that makes a child difficult, that makes them ask questions that don't have comfortable answers, notice inconsistencies that adults would rather leave unexamined, and demonstrate a capacity for observation that most adults find unsettling in someone who is supposed to simply be obedient. In that household, that intelligence did not protect him. If anything, it made him a more interesting target for whatever shaped him in those years. At school, older boys targeted him the way boys always target the ones who are clearly different, the ones who read too much, notice too much, seem to be calculating something that nobody around them can see. One afternoon when he was about 5 years old, a group of older boys chased him down the street and shoved him through the door of a local doctor's office. They thought it would terrify him. The doctor's examining room had a full human skeleton mounted in the corner, wired together at every joint, standing upright in the dim light, every bone in its proper anatomical position. The boys expected screaming, maybe crying, maybe the satisfaction of having found the thing that would crack the composure of the strange, watchful Mudgett boy. Herman went quiet. He walked up to the skeleton and stood in front of it for a long time, studying it with the focused attention he brought to everything that actually interested him. He reached out and touched the ribs, ran his fingers along the line of the jaw, lifted one of the arm bones, and examined the joint where it connected to the shoulder. The doctor, watching from across the room, later said that the boy didn't look frightened at all. He looked fascinated. That was the moment, or at least the moment that people would point to later, looking back, trying to find the place where it had started. Because after that afternoon, Herman Mudgett became consumed by anatomy, by the mechanics of the human body, by what was inside people, how it all connected and functioned, and above all, by what happened to it when the whole elaborate system stopped running. He read every medical text the town library carried. He borrowed books from neighboring towns. He drew diagrams of the skeleton from memory and tested himself until he had every bone named correctly. He began performing surgeries on neighborhood animals before he was 10 years old. Pets went missing from nearby houses and turned up in conditions that nobody in the community discussed in any detail. Parents told their children to stay away from the Mudgett boy. Teachers noted something specific and unsettling in his manner. Not malice exactly, not anything they could have defined clearly, but something in the way he observed the people around him, not with the curiosity of a boy who wanted to understand people. More like the assessment of someone who was working out how they functioned, the way you might study a piece of machinery you were thinking of taking apart. There is one more detail from his childhood that appears in multiple accounts, and that has never been confirmed or disproven. A friend, a boy about his own age. They were playing together in an abandoned building on the edge of town. The kind of empty structure that draws boys in places where there isn't much else to explore. The boy fell from an upper floor. He died. Whether Herman pushed him, whether it was an accident, Whether the story is even entirely true, nobody has ever established with certainty. What is documented is that the people of Gilmanton, who had known Herman Mudgett all his life, remembered him differently after that day, and that Herman himself, by every account that survives, appeared to be entirely, genuinely unaffected. There is something consistent in all of these early details: the animals, the bones, the watching, the friend who fell. And it is not what you might expect. It is not rage. It is not chaos. What's consistent is stillness. A quality of absolute stillness and observation, an absence of ordinary emotional response to things that would disturb most people, and a persistent, focused interest in the mechanics of what happened when living things stopped living. He was, by all accounts, a normal-seeming boy in most surface respects. He was polite to adults, performed adequately in the expected ways, and gave no one a clear reason to say something specific was wrong. The wrongness was in the negative space, in what was absent rather than present. The ordinary responses that weren't there, the distress that didn't come when it should have. He graduated high school at 16, the top student by a considerable margin, which surprised nobody who had taught him, spent a semester at the University of Vermont, then transferred to the University of Michigan Medical School in Ann Arbor. It was the right place for him. For the first time in his life, he had legitimate and institutional access to what he had always been drawn to: human bodies. The school maintained a legal supply of cadavers for the anatomy courses, standard practice at any medical school of the era. But Holmes quickly realized that the legal supply was not the only supply available to a medical student with sufficient nerve and a willingness to work at night. He began stealing bodies from the campus morgue, digging up fresh graves in the cemetery near the school. He would strip the corpse down to the skeleton, then use it to file a fraudulent life insurance claim, take out a policy on a person he had invented, produce the skeleton as proof of death, and collect the payout from the insurance company before anyone could look too closely. He was 20 years old. He had already discovered, with a clarity he would never lose, that dead bodies were worth money, not just the one-time payout of a fraudulent insurance claim. The skeletons themselves were worth money. The organs were worth money. Human anatomy, carefully preserved and properly presented, had a reliable and ongoing market in the medical education system of the 1880s. A system that needed more cadavers than it could legally obtain, and that had developed over decades a practical tolerance for not asking too many questions about where its specimens came from. He filed his first fraudulent insurance claims while still a student, using cadavers he had stolen from the campus morgue or exhumed from the cemetery near the school as the supposed remains of people he had invented. He would take out a life insurance policy on a fictitious individual, wait the required period, produce the skeleton as evidence of death, and collect the payout. It required patience, attention to paperwork, and a complete comfort with lying to institutional authorities, all qualities he possessed in abundance. He collected. He refined the method. He began to understand, in the systematic way he understood everything that interested him, the precise relationship between access to human remains, the willingness of institutions to pay for them, and the willingness of insurance companies to pay out on plausible claims. He was building a mental model of how money moved through systems that were designed to handle death. It would serve him for the rest of his life. He graduated in 1884. He had a wife, a woman named Clara Lovering, whom he had married at 18 in the early years before medical school, when he was still Herman Mudgett from New Hampshire, and the future was still theoretical. He had a young son with her. He left them both with Clara's parents, walked out without an explanation or a forwarding address, and never communicated with either of them again in any form that has been documented. He seems to have done this without any visible anguish or hesitation. He simply decided that chapter was finished and opened the next one. He chose the new name the way he chose everything that mattered, deliberately, with specific intent. He borrowed it from a fictional English detective whose combination of cold analytical intelligence and seamless surface warmth he apparently found worth emulating. The name sounded like a doctor. It sounded like someone you could trust. Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. He arrived in Chicago in 1886 with no money and no connections, and the kind of focused intelligence that, in the right environment, could build either remarkable things or terrible ones. He understood within the first weeks of arriving that Chicago was exactly the right environment. Chicago in the mid-1880s was a city eating itself alive in its effort to grow fast enough. The Great Fire of 1871 had burned 60 square miles to ash and rubble, and the city had spent the 14 years since rebuilding itself into something that barely resembled what had stood there before. Taller, louder, angrier, more desperate and more ambitious than anything in its previous history. The population had doubled twice over in that time. The stockyards ran around the clock, the smell of blood and rendering and industry hanging over the south side like its own permanent weather front. The streets were jammed with immigrants from a dozen countries: Polish, German, Irish, Italian, Czech, Scandinavian, all of them pursuing the same thing in their different languages: a foothold, a wage, a piece of whatever was happening here. It was chaotic in ways that were simultaneously thrilling and useful. Nobody had time to check credentials carefully. Nobody was paying close enough attention to notice inconsistencies in a plausible story delivered confidently by a well-dressed man with a medical degree. The city was too busy becoming itself. Holmes arrived in the Englewood neighborhood on the south side and walked into a pharmacy on the corner, presenting himself as a physician looking for work. The owner was a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Holton. Her husband was seriously ill and unable to work, and she needed someone reliable and knowledgeable to help manage the store. Holmes was charming and capable and presented exactly the right balance of professional competence and personal warmth. He was extraordinarily good at that assessment, at reading what a specific person in a specific situation needed from the person in front of them, and then delivering exactly that with enough precision to be convincing and enough restraint to seem genuine rather than performed. Within a year of Holmes arriving at the pharmacy, Dr. Holton's husband was dead. A short time after that, Dr. Holton herself disappeared. Holmes explained to the neighbors that she had decided to relocate to California for her health, the climate in Illinois not suiting her since her husband's death. He told her creditors that she had sold him the business before leaving and produced paperwork to that effect. The paperwork, investigators would establish years later, was entirely fabricated. But by then, Holmes had what he needed: the pharmacy, the neighborhood's goodwill, and his attention fixed on the empty lot directly across the street. He had a building in mind. He had been thinking about it for years. Construction began in 1887 on a corner lot in Englewood that Holmes had purchased using money that didn't quite belong to him, in a transaction that would not have survived close scrutiny. Holmes hired a contractor and a full crew and started building. Within a few weeks, he dismissed them all, brought in a second crew, fired them too, a month later. Over the next 5 years, he cycled through more than a dozen different construction teams, sometimes letting workers go after a few weeks, sometimes after just a few days. He always had the same explanation: the previous crew had done shoddy work and he refused to pay for it, which also conveniently meant he often paid them nothing at all. Workers who tried to collect were met with paperwork disputes, legal threats, and a man who was so calm and so certain of himself in any confrontation that most of them eventually just gave up and walked away. The real reason for the constant turnover had nothing to do with the quality of the work. No single crew ever saw enough of the building to understand what they were actually building. Think about what that required for a moment. It required Holmes to hold the complete architectural and mechanical design of a 100-room building in his head at all times, to know precisely which workers had seen which elements, and to manage the handoffs between crews so that no single person could connect the pieces. The men who installed the gas lines on the second floor had no knowledge of the windowless rooms those lines fed into. They were just running pipe as far as they knew. The crew that dug out the basement and laid the drainage system had no idea about the chutes being built in the floors above them. They were just doing foundation work. The carpenters who framed rooms with doors that locked only from the outside didn't know how those rooms connected to anything else, or why a room would need to prevent the person inside from opening the door. They were just following the blueprint. The man who built the large airtight vault on the second floor, accessible only through the single door from Holmes' office, was told it was a walk-in safe for sensitive business documents. Each worker saw his portion. His portion made sense. What it didn't make sense as was part of a complete building, because no worker ever saw enough to assemble the complete building in his mind. Only Holmes could do that. Only Holmes needed to. The method also had a secondary benefit that Holmes appreciated. Workers he fired before they finished their portion could be denied payment. Shoddy work, he would say. Unacceptable quality. He had the paperwork. He always had the paperwork. And most of the workers decided the legal fight wasn't worth it and moved on. Holmes built much of the building at a significant discount. By 1892, when construction was finally complete, the building had grown to 3 full stories and roughly 100 rooms. The ground floor was entirely commercial. A pharmacy where Holmes worked behind the counter himself, a jewelry store, a restaurant. Busy, legitimate, and alive with the kind of ordinary neighborhood foot traffic that made a building look entirely normal from the outside. The second floor was different. Rooms with no windows and doors that locked only from outside. Hallways that curved and doubled back in ways that had no architectural logic. Built specifically to disorient, to confuse, to make it very difficult for someone unfamiliar with the layout to find a way out quickly or reliably. Gas jets set into the walls of several rooms, all of them running back to a single control panel in Holmes's private office at the far end of the hall. Peepholes drilled through the walls at precisely eye level, positioned so that the occupant of any given room could be observed from the hallway without any possible way of knowing they were being watched. A large airtight vault, one door, accessible only from Holmes's office. The basement was different again. A kiln, built to reach temperatures that could reduce human bone to ash over the course of several hours of sustained heat. Vats of acid and quicklime, sized for practical use rather than display. A solid dissection table, low and wide, already deeply stained by the time investigators found it. A full set of surgical instruments arranged on a shelf along the far wall with the orderly precision of a professional who used them regularly. Chutes running down from the floors above, their lower openings positioned directly over the vats. When investigators opened the kiln after Holmes's arrest and sifted through what was at the bottom, they found bone fragments and a small gold chain of the kind women wore attached to their shoes in that era. That was all that remained of whoever had been in there last. Holmes, when investigators asked about the building's unusual design features, shrugged and said he had always been interested in unconventional architecture. It was not the worst lie he ever told. It was far from the most convincing. Even before the World's Fair opened in May of 1893, Holmes had begun filling his building with victims. His method was consistent across every victim, and it worked by exploiting the same thing every single time: trust. Holmes was, by every account that survives from people who encountered him, extraordinarily good-looking by the standards of his era. Tall, broad-shouldered, Dark hair, clear blue eyes, that person after person described as unusually direct. The kind of gaze that makes whoever it rests on feel, for the duration of that conversation, like the most important person in the room. He spoke carefully, chose his words with deliberate precision, and possessed that specific quality, rare and genuinely dangerous, of making people feel understood, not just heard, actually seen, as if he had looked at them and grasped, in a way that most people in their lives never quite managed, what they actually needed. People trusted him quickly. Women were drawn to him easily and consistently. He was aware of both of these things with the same clarity he brought to everything else, and he used them with the same systematic efficiency. One of his earliest confirmed victims at the building was a woman named Julia Smythe Connor, a bookkeeper he hired to work at the ground floor pharmacy. She was in her mid-20s, married to a man named Ned, with a young daughter named Pearl. The three of them moved into the building together, into rooms on one of the upper floors, which Holmes managed as rental apartments. Holmes began an affair with Julia. Ned Connor found out. There were scenes, arguments, accusations, the ugly, compressed violence of a marriage coming apart in close quarters in a building owned by the man who had destroyed it. Eventually, Ned packed his things and left. He took nothing that mattered to Holmes. Julia and Pearl stayed. The affair continued through the fall of 1891 and into December. Julia seems to have believed, or tried to believe, that the situation was stable, that she had made a choice, and it was the right one, that this man who was so attentive and so certain of himself would hold. On Christmas Eve of 1891, both Julia and Pearl disappeared. Holmes told the neighbors she had decided to move away, that the relationship hadn't worked out, that she had taken Pearl and gone. Nobody found this surprising. Women left situations that hadn't worked out. Children went with their mothers. Life in a city this size was full of people coming and going, and nobody kept close enough track to notice when the coming and going stopped making sense. In the basement, the kiln burned. There is something worth pausing on here. Not the mechanism of what happened, but the experience of what it must have been like to be in that building without knowing what it was. You came in through the front door, which looked like any front door on a respectable commercial block. The ground floor was busy and normal. The smell of the pharmacy, the sound of customers, the ordinary midday light of a working Chicago street coming through the windows. Nothing alarming, nothing out of place. You went upstairs. Holmes had a smooth explanation for why you were being taken up through a particular door rather than a different one. Why this particular hallway rather than that one. He always had smooth explanations. You followed him because he was your employer, or your host, or the man you were planning to marry, or simply a gentleman who had offered you a room at a reasonable rate in a city where you didn't know anyone. On the second floor, the hallways did something strange. You turned right and found yourself somehow back near where you'd started. You turned left, and the corridor ended at a blank wall that looked like it might have once been a door. The windows, you would only notice it gradually, weren't there. You were deep inside the building, and the light wasn't coming from anywhere you could identify. And behind one of these doors, a room, with a door that locked from the outside. Holmes, in his office at the end of the hall, had his hand on a panel. Over the following years, the pattern repeated. New women came into the building, secretaries answering advertisements, stenographers hired for office work. Women who came to Chicago looking for employment and found Dr. Holmes extending exactly the right kind of offer at exactly the right moment. He required many of his employees, as a stated condition of the position, to take out life insurance policies, naming him as the beneficiary. He presented this as normal business practice. the kind of forward-thinking arrangement that responsible employers maintained. Some accepted this without hesitation. Others felt something off about it and then pushed the feeling aside because they needed the work, and he was so matter-of-fact about it, so obviously a serious and responsible businessman, that doubting him felt unreasonable. After he killed them, he sold their skeletons to medical schools. His contacts from Ann Arbor were still active. The schools needed cadavers on a regular and ongoing basis, maintained a professional practice of not asking difficult questions about where remains had come from, and paid fair rates for well-articulated specimens. Holmes stripped the bodies on the dissection table in the basement, methodically, efficiently, with the calm competence of a man who had been doing this since his 20s. Articulated the skeletons, packed them into wooden crates, and arranged delivery through channels that had been established and tested over years. He was profiting from each person twice. Once from the life insurance policy, once from their bones. He was also, throughout all of this, married to at least 4 different women simultaneously, not one of whom had any knowledge of the others. One was still waiting in New Hampshire, raising his son alone, years into an absence that had never been explained. Another believed she was his only wife and had no reason to think otherwise. A third had owned substantial property in Texas, which had been the primary reason he proposed to her in the first place. He managed all of this the same way he managed everything else. He lied. Not nervously, not defensively, not with the tells that most people who lie display when they're afraid of being caught. He lied the way other people breathe, automatically, without friction, without any apparent internal experience of what he was doing as in any way unusual or requiring effort. Each woman got a version of Holmes that felt entirely and unmistakably real, because when he was with her, he committed to it completely. The performance never broke. There was never a moment where something behind the eyes slipped and revealed the actual mechanism. That, more than the building, more than the insurance schemes, more than any individual scheme or act, that was his genuine achievement. The ability to be whoever a situation required, fully, for precisely as long as necessary, with no visible seam. And then, in the spring of 1893, the World's Fair opened, and the city of Chicago delivered 27 million strangers directly to his door. The Columbian Exposition of 1893 was one of the defining spectacles of the American 19th century, and to understand what Holmes saw when he looked at it, you need to understand what it actually was. 600 acres of Jackson Park on the south side transformed in under 2 years from lakeside swampland into something that had no precedent. The main buildings were enormous, 12 stories and more, constructed in the Beaux-Arts style, their facades covered in a white material that gleamed in daylight and reflected electric light off the surface of the lagoons at night. People who had grown up in small towns and never seen electric lighting at any scale stood at the water's edge after dark and could not find language adequate to describe what they were looking at. Some of them wept. The Ferris wheel, 164 feet in diameter, 36 gondolas, 60 passengers each, made its first rotations that summer. It was the largest moving structure built by human beings to that point in history. People lined up for hours to ride it. From the top of its arc on a clear day, you could see the full sprawl of Chicago laid out below, and beyond it, the flat gray edge of Lake Michigan stretching to the horizon, and passengers who made it to the top reported an experience of the world's scale that most of them had never previously had access to. Nikola Tesla demonstrated alternating current. Buffalo Bill Cody ran his Wild West show twice daily just outside the main gates and sold it out every time. Frederick Law Olmsted designed the landscape. The first American gas-powered automobile was on public display, and crowds gathered around it to argue about whether it had a future. A building was dedicated entirely to the achievements of women. Its exhibitions drew enormous crowds from the first day of the fair through the last. There was a 1,500-pound statue of Venus de Milo constructed entirely from chocolate, which people found simultaneously impressive and slightly disturbing. The whole thing ran for 6 months, from May through October. And during those 6 months, it was the most visited single location in the Western Hemisphere. It was extraordinary, genuinely, historically, objectively extraordinary. And it created precisely the conditions Holmes had been designing his building to exploit since he first broke ground 5 years earlier. The fair drew a specific kind of visitor in vast numbers. People who were far from home, far from anyone who knew them, alone in an unfamiliar city of 1 million people, excited and slightly off balance and very open to the right kind of attention from a trustworthy-seeming stranger. Young women especially, secretaries, shop girls, school teachers, farm girls from small towns who had spent years reading about the exposition in their hometown newspapers and had finally saved enough money and worked up enough nerve to make the trip, arrived by the thousands throughout the summer. Many came alone. Many had never been to a city this size. Many found it exhilarating and disorienting in equal measure, which was exactly the right emotional state for a man like Holmes. When a woman in that situation disappeared from view, the gap between her disappearance and the moment anyone at home noticed could easily be measured in weeks. She was supposed to be experiencing the fair. She was supposed to be absorbed in something new and large and exciting. A lull in the letters was easy to explain. She was busy, she was overwhelmed, she would write when she had time. By the time the explanation wore thin and concern became alarm, Holmes was long past whatever had happened to her. Holmes's building sat 3 miles from the fairgrounds, close enough to be a practical and convenient place to stay for someone looking for affordable accommodations near the exposition. Far enough from the center of the spectacle that nobody in the neighborhood was paying close attention to the flow of guests through the front door. He advertised rooms at competitive rates, presented himself as a respectable local physician extending hospitality to fair visitors, and maintained the comfortable fiction of a normal hotel for anyone who looked from the outside. The women who checked in that summer and wrote home described him consistently as an excellent host. Attentive, remembered your preferences, seemed genuinely pleased to see you when you came back from the fair each evening. The rooms were clean, the rates were honest, the doctor was a real gentleman. Then the letters stopped, and when they stopped, the families waited for them to start again. Because that was what you did. Because there was an innocent explanation for everything when you didn't know what else to look for. Among his most documented victims was a young woman named Emmeline Sigrand, 24 years old, a stenographer Holmes had recruited from a sanitarium in Indiana, where he had briefly been a patient, and where he had made precisely the impression he always made on people who encountered him. Emmeline came to Chicago with energy and purpose. She had a fiancé she planned to marry. She had her whole future ahead of her, and she knew it, and she was excited about it. Holmes hired her as his personal secretary. He was, for her, everything a young woman alone in a new city in 1893 might have hoped for in an employer. And then, gradually, more than that. He was attentive. He noticed things about her. He remembered what she said in conversations and referenced it later. He made her feel, in the way he made everyone feel when he chose to, that she was seen and valued in a way that was specific to her and not interchangeable with anyone else. It was entirely constructed. Every element of it was calculated. But it felt real. It felt real in the way things feel real when they are performed without visible effort by someone who has practiced them long enough that they require none. Once Emmeline had signed a power of attorney over her bank accounts, presented to her by Holmes as a routine administrative arrangement between a trusted employer and employee. The kind of thing that apparently just how serious professional relationships worked. He sealed her inside the airtight vault in his office and stood at the peephole. She was 24 years old. She had a fiancé waiting for her. She had her whole life in front of her, and she knew it, and she was excited about it in the way that people are excited about their lives when they are 24 and things are going well. The vault was airtight. Holmes watched through a hole the size of a quarter until it was over. Minnie Williams came to Chicago to marry him. She had owned substantial property in Texas and had, before the wedding, transferred the deed to Holmes as a demonstration of her complete trust. Her way of showing him that she was fully committed, that she had chosen him entirely. Her younger sister Annie traveled to Chicago to visit them after the wedding. Both sisters disappeared within weeks of each other. Holmes told their mutual acquaintances they had gone to Europe for an extended holiday. Neither of them was ever seen again. There were others throughout the fair's run whose stories have been less fully reconstructed. Women who wrote letters home that stopped arriving, employees who collected one paycheck and never showed up for a second, guests who checked into the hotel and left no forwarding address. The building processed them. The building was designed to process them, each room serving the purpose it had been built to serve, each feature functioning as intended. The gas lines ran to the panel in Holmes's office. The chutes ran to the basement. The kiln ran through the night. The total number remains unknown. The confirmed number is 9. The truth is somewhere between those two figures, and no one has ever been able to establish where. Benjamin Pitterzell was not a victim of the building. He was Holmes's business partner, a fellow con man who had worked various schemes with Holmes over several years and who trusted him far more than the situation warranted. Pitterzell was not naive. He was himself a criminal, a man who had spent years operating outside the law and who understood, or thought he understood, the kind of man Holmes was. He didn't understand. The plan they agreed on was straightforward. Pitterzell would fake his own death. Holmes would present a body to the life insurance company as proof of Pitterzell's death. A cadaver, sourced through Holmes's medical connections, convincing enough to pass examination. They would collect on a $10,000 policy and split the proceeds. Holmes had run variations of this scheme before in different forms with different partners. It was reliable. It worked. Holmes convinced Pitterzell that using a real cadaver for the medical examination was the safest approach. More convincing than a living man pretending to be dead. Less risk of the fraud being detected. Pitterzell agreed. Then Holmes killed Pitterzell and used Pitterzell's actual body. He collected the full $10,000. He kept all of it. Howard was 8 years old. Nellie was 11. Alice was 15. Carrie was a woman who had just been told her husband was dead, then told he wasn't, in a state of grief and confusion and complete informational dependency on the one man who seemed to know what was actually happening. She let Holmes take the children. Howard's burned remains were found at a cottage Holmes had rented in Indianapolis. The medical examiner determined his body had been burned after death, not before. The fire had been set to conceal what had already been done. Nellie and Alice were found in Toronto, in the basement of a house Holmes had rented under a false name, locked inside a large trunk that had been sealed from the outside. The medical examiner determined they had been gassed. They were 8 years old and 11 years old and 15 years old. They had been traveling with Holmes for weeks across multiple states, believing they were being taken to see their father. They were in a city they had never been to, in a house they didn't know, locked in a trunk. Holmes was in another city preparing his next scheme when their bodies were found. He appears to have given them very little thought once they were no longer useful. Holmes made one mistake. and it was the kind of mistake that only happens to people who have been right about everything for long enough that they stop accounting for the possibility of being wrong. After the fair closed in October of 1893, the flood of visitors drained out of Chicago almost as fast as it had come in. The city's economy contracted sharply. The particular conditions Holmes had been operating in, a city overwhelmed with strangers, all of them far from home, all of them disoriented in the best possible way, were gone. He began moving. He had always moved when conditions changed. It was one of his most reliable instincts. He traveled through several states, running smaller versions of the schemes he had always run: insurance fraud, horse theft, a variation on the Holton pharmacy situation he had perfected in Chicago. None of them required a building. None of them required a kiln or a dissection table. They just required what he had always had: a plausible appearance, a smooth story, and the ability to become whatever a situation required. In 1894, he found himself in a jail cell in St. Louis on a horse theft charge, a minor thing by the standards of his actual history, and his cellmate was a man named Marion Hedgepeth. Hedgepeth was known throughout the Missouri region as the handsome bandit. He was genuinely good-looking, genuinely charming in a rough way, and had become a minor celebrity through the dime novels that covered his exploits as a train robber. He was doing a long stretch, and he had time, and he was the kind of man who liked to talk. Holmes liked that. He told Hedgepeth he was planning an insurance scheme and needed a reliable contact. Specifically, a lawyer who was willing to be helpful in ways that weren't entirely above board. In exchange for the introduction, he promised Hedgepeth $2,500 when the money came through. Hedgepeth thought about it and gave him a name. Holmes ran the scheme, collected the money, and sent Hedgepeth precisely nothing. Not $2,500, not $500, not a single dollar. This was, for Holmes, completely consistent behavior. He had left unpaid debts and broken promises behind him in every city he had ever operated in: the construction crews in Chicago, the creditors of the businesses he had absorbed, the wives he had married and abandoned, people he had made promises to and then simply moved on from, as if the promises had never existed. It was one of the most consistent things about him. Hedgepeth sat in his cell. He thought about it for a while. He weighed his options, which were limited. And then he asked to speak with investigators. He told them about the insurance scheme. He gave them Holmes's name, his current name, the one he was using at the time, and told them the city he had said he was heading to next. Hedgepeth had no idea he was sitting on information about a man who had killed at minimum a dozen people. He was simply a man who had been cheated on a deal and had decided, since he had nothing left to lose, to cause as much trouble for the person who cheated him as possible. It was enough. Insurance investigators began pulling on the thread of the Petersell death claim. The more carefully they examined it, the less it looked like anything natural. They traced Holmes' movements backward through several cities, tracking him through aliases and boarding house registrations and the faint paper trails left by the fraud schemes. They communicated across state lines in ways that law enforcement rarely managed to do effectively in that era. Slowly, over several months, they assembled a picture of a man who had been moving through the country for nearly a decade, leaving behind him a pattern of deaths and disappearances and insurance payouts that no single jurisdiction had ever been in a position to see whole. They tracked him to Boston. He was staying at a boarding house in the west end of the city, registered under the name H.M. Howell of Denver, Colorado, preparing what would have been his next scheme. He had, by this point, been running variations of the same operations for nearly 15 years without serious interference. He had been arrested before, briefly, and the charges had dissolved or been resolved. He had passed through dozens of cities. He had built and used and abandoned the murder castle in Chicago and moved on. He appears to have genuinely believed at this point that he was simply better at this than anyone who might ever try to catch him. On a November afternoon in 1894, Boston police officers and a Pinkerton detective walked through the front door of the boarding house. The man, registered as H.M. Howell of Denver, Colorado, stood up from his chair and said nothing. His real name, they already knew, was H.H. Holmes. The arrest in Boston was front-page news across the country within 24 hours. Holmes was famous before the trial even started. Famous in the way that only the 19th century could make a person famous, through the telegraph and the newspaper press, and a public appetite for exactly this kind of story that was, in 1894, completely insatiable. But the real story, the one that would define Holmes's place in American history, didn't begin with the arrest. It began when investigators went back to Chicago and started going through the building. It took weeks to document what they found. The gas lines running through the walls of the second-floor rooms, every one controlled from the single panel in Holmes's private office. The doors that locked exclusively from outside. The vault, airtight, accessible only through Holmes' office, with no mechanism on the interior for the person inside to open it. The chutes, coming down from the floors above, their angles calculated to deposit what they carried directly into the acid vats. The dissection table, solid, built low to the ground, stained in ways that the medical examiner confirmed were consistent with human tissue and human blood. The kiln. And at the bottom of the kiln, when investigators sifted through carefully fragments of human bone and a small gold chain. In the rooms on the upper floors, among letters that had never been mailed and photographs and personal effects scattered through the spaces where people had lived and then stopped living, investigators began to put together a list of the people who had come to this building and never left. The list grew. Each name on it represented a person who had come to Chicago with their savings and their plans and their particular reasons for trusting the charming doctor on the corner, and who had then simply ceased to exist in any traceable way. The building had processed them. The building had been designed to process them. And it had worked exactly as designed for years in the middle of a working neighborhood surrounded by people who had no idea. In the rooms upstairs, investigators found letters that had never been mailed, photographs of women, jewelry, personal effects belonging to people who had come to the building and never left. Investigators identified the building's layout with growing disbelief. The hallways that looped back on themselves, the rooms with no windows, the staircase that ended in a blank wall, the doors that had been deliberately engineered so that the person inside could not open them. There was no innocent explanation for any of this. None. In the months after the initial search, the building caught fire twice under circumstances that nobody could satisfactorily explain and for which nobody was ever charged. Holmes, from his cell in Philadelphia, said he had nothing to do with either fire and suggested investigators look elsewhere. Nobody was particularly interested in looking elsewhere. Newspapers across the country printed the story of the murder castle with an appetite that seemed to have no ceiling. Some of what they published was accurate and documented. Much of it was not. The victim count climbed from 9 to 27 to 50 to 200, depending on which paper you read and which day it was. Gas jets became elaborate torture chambers designed for maximum suffering. The kiln became a furnace of industrial scale. The building became a Gothic dungeon transplanted into the middle of a working-class Chicago neighborhood. The legend grew faster than the facts could hold it. But here is what no newspaper needed to embellish, exaggerate, or invent. Holmes killed at least 9 people, possibly a great many more. He sold their skeletons to medical schools. He killed 3 children who were 8, 11, and 15 years old. He spent 6 years designing and constructing a building whose purpose was murder, assembled crew by crew so that no single person would ever understand what they were building. The kiln was real. The dissection table was real. The gold chain in the ash was real. The peepholes were real. The truth was already more than enough. At trial, Holmes was calm, articulate, and almost entirely unconvincing. He dismissed the physical evidence as circumstantial. He revised his account of events several times over the course of the proceedings, each version incompatible with the last. At one point, in a move that seemed calculated more for dramatic effect than legal strategy, he claimed to have been possessed by the devil since birth, a statement that read to most observers in the courtroom as less a legal defense than a performance by a man who had always found performance natural. He was convicted in October of 1895 of the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. The verdict covered only the one death most directly proven by the evidence available. The others, the women of the building, the employees, the guests, the gold chain in the kiln, existed in the record, in the investigation files, in the accounts of families who had written to Chicago looking for missing sons and daughters. But the law requires evidence specific enough to meet a particular standard, and Holmes had spent a decade ensuring that evidence of that kind was very difficult to produce. The kiln and the acid had done their work well. The sentence was death. In the months between the verdict and the date of execution, Holmes sat in a cell at Moyer-Mensing Prison in Philadelphia and wrote. He produced a 256-page manuscript arguing his own innocence, a document so dense with internal contradictions, invented timelines, and fabricated supporting details that even his own attorneys said they couldn't follow it. He sold a separate confession to a Hearst newspaper for $7,500, a substantial sum, in which he claimed to have committed over 100 murders. Then said he had been possessed by the devil since the moment of his birth, then revised the murder count downward, then added several victims he later admitted were still alive, then said he wasn't sure about several more. He could not stop performing. Not even now, with nothing left to gain, with the date already set and the gallows already built. He kept constructing versions of himself and presenting them to whoever would still pay attention, because that was what he had always done, and he appeared genuinely incapable of doing otherwise. Prison guards who watched him in those final months noted the same thing consistently. He was entirely calm, no visible anxiety, no nightmares that disturbed his sleep, no moments where the composure cracked. He ate his meals, wrote his pages, and received his visitors with the same easy self-possession he had always projected. He slept well every night until the last one. The night before the execution, he ate a full dinner, slept soundly, and in the morning dressed carefully in the suit he had requested be brought from storage, his best one, the one that fit properly. He told the prison chaplain he had no regrets. He was hanged on the 7th of May, 1896. He was 34 years old. The execution did not proceed cleanly. The drop failed to break his neck, and witnesses reported that his body convulsed for close to 15 minutes before the prison physician confirmed that he was dead. Holmes had made a final written request from his cell. He wanted to be buried in a cement-filled coffin sunk 10 full feet below the surface of the ground, with no marker placed on the grave and no indication of where exactly it was located. He was afraid of grave robbers. The man who had spent a decade stripping bodies, articulating the skeletons, and shipping them in wooden crates to medical schools was genuinely, apparently deeply terrified of having his own remains disturbed after death. His request was granted in full. His grave in Holy Cross Cemetery outside Philadelphia is still there. It is still unmarked. It is still exactly 10 feet down, exactly as specified. The building in Englewood stood for another year. Then it burned. Nobody was charged. Nobody was particularly surprised. The investigation had stripped the interior of most of what remained. Journalists and the curious had picked over what the investigators left behind. In August of 1895, before the final fire, a United States post office had moved into the ground floor of the building because life had continued to function around the building the whole time, the way it always continues around places where terrible things happened. People mailed letters from the same address where bodies had traveled down chutes to a basement dissection table. Postal workers stamped envelopes at the counter where Holmes had once stood in his white coat, where he had been the neighborhood's charming doctor, where the whole construction of who he pretended to be had first been assembled and presented to the world. After the fire took the rest of it, the lot sat empty for a long time. Today, a post office still occupies that block on West 63rd Street on the south side of Chicago. People stand in line there to mail packages. The clerks stamp envelopes. Nobody standing in that line is thinking about the ground underneath them, or about what stood there once, or about the man who built it, which is, in its own quiet way, exactly what he would have wanted. There's a question that stays with you after you learn everything there is to know about H. Holmes. It isn't about the building. It isn't about the number of victims or the mechanics of what happened in those rooms. It's about the name, the White City. They called the exposition the White City because of those gleaming Beaux-Arts facades, those enormous white buildings that lined the lagoons and caught the sunlight during the day and blazed with electric light at night. The name meant progress. It meant civilization at its most refined. It meant everything that human intelligence and human ambition and human cooperation could produce when properly organized and properly directed towards something worth building. The White City was the best argument anyone had yet made in physical form for what America could become and what it was already becoming. Right there in front of you, in the summer of 1893, 27 million people came to see it. They walked through it and saw the future laid out before them in light and steel and motion. More progress, more possibility, more sheer human achievement concentrated in one place than most of them had ever encountered. They rode the Ferris wheel and looked out over the city from 250 feet in the air. They watched electricity do things it had never publicly done before on that scale. They walked out of the gates in the evening carrying that specific feeling, the rare one, the kind you only get a few times in a life, that the world was genuinely, measurably about to become something magnificent. They went home and wrote letters about it. They told their children about it. The summer of 1893 was the summer the future arrived, and they had been there. 3 miles away, a man in a 3-story building was watching them come off the trains. He was watching for the ones who were alone. He was watching for the ones who looked like they wouldn't be missed right away, whose disappearance would be explained away as adventure, as starting over, as the story of a young woman who had gone to Chicago and found a new life. He was watching for the ones who were so full of hope about where the world was going, so open to possibility, so completely willing to extend their trust to a charming man in a good suit, that they couldn't see what was standing directly in front of them. There is one specific detail from the investigation of the building that shows up in several accounts and that nobody who encounters it can quite put down. When detectives searched the second floor after Holmes's arrest, they found the peepholes he had drilled through the walls of the sealed rooms. Every single one was positioned at exactly eye level. He had watched them. While the gas ran through the lines in the walls, and the air in the room went thin, and the sounds from inside, whatever sounds there were, changed and then faded. He had stood in the hallway on the other side of the wall and watched through a hole the size of a quarter. He had been there for all of it. "I was born with the devil in me," he wrote from his cell in the confession he sold for $7,500. "I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing." But the word that actually stays with you is not murderer. It is poet. He thought of himself as someone creating something. The castle was not just a tool, it was a work. The product of 6 years of planning and designing and problem-solving, assembled piece by piece, each crew seeing only their portion so that no one but Holmes could ever comprehend the whole. He was proud of it. He built it the way a craftsman builds something he intends to last. And for nearly a decade, in the middle of a functioning city, under the noses of neighbors and police, and an entire system theoretically designed to catch people like him, it worked exactly as designed. It worked because he understood something about how people see the world and what they are and are not capable of imagining. People look at a yellow Victorian building with lace curtains in the windows and a friendly doctor behind the pharmacy counter, and they see a building. They see a neighborhood. They see something that looks like home. They do not see a machine. 27 million people came to Chicago that summer to see what human beings were capable of building. 3 miles from the White City, one of them had already built his answer. He had been living in it for years.